Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. It's David here, and in this tutorial we're going to go back to the roots in Realflow. And as you'll see, I was quite a bit rusty now that I've been spending some time trying to get up to speed with Houdini. But we have this little project where I'm going to provide you with a collider that I've modeled in Houdini, and we're going to use it to kind of create a bit of a riverbed simulation. And I gotta say, I was quite pleasantly surprised how this, we're not there yet. This is going to be the first part in a series where in this one we're going to take the collider and figure out the initial settings for the simulation, how to emit the initial volume of liquid, how to start dialing in the right resolution to get as much detail as we want out of this, and we're going to also touch on the mesh and just the initial bit of secondaries. So it's already starting to look pretty good, so I hope you want to get on this journey with me. Yeah, there were some hiccups on the way. I ran out of disk space. I'm gonna have to figure that out for the next part. And my idea is, just pragmatically based on the fact that I don't really have a Maya license anymore, and that's always been my go-to for rendering my Realflow sims. So we're just gonna have to explore something new here. And my plan is that's going to be trying to get this into Blender and render it there using cycles, I guess. So that's going to be exciting. So I hope you want to stay tuned for this little series, and let's see what we can come up with together. Enjoy! Alright, it's good to be back in Realflow where it all began. So let's dive in, and I'm just going to set up a project, and I have made a little tutorial project, and inside of that project I'm gonna make this one, call it P River project. Okay, I'm gonna make an empty project, and I'm just gonna, as usual, hit A two times to start and stop sim, which is gonna create the subfolders on disk for me. And then I'm going to go import the object, and you'll have it in your downloads probably. Let's cut it and go back to the OBJ folder where it's going to look by default, and paste it there. So here we have this little riverbed collider that I made in Houdini, and I'm including it for you on the Patreon page for this post. It should be, I've used adaptivity, so it adds less triangles in areas where it's flat and doesn't have so much detail. So it should be enough to get some collisions with the pebbles on the riverbed floor, and it should be, light enough to be managed by Realflow. So let's start setting this up. And by the way, if you don't feel like using the one I have, it should be pretty straightforward, like just creating a basic scene inside of Realflow with just boxes and a sloping plane and putting out a few spheres as colliders. But I feel like with this kind of detail, it's gonna be, we're gonna get a lot for free, so to speak. I'm just gonna give it a grayish color, and let's start setting this up. So this is our riverbed collider. We can already see from the start we need a collider up here as well, because we're gonna start by putting out one emitter that spans across the whole riverbed like this. So we have like an initial volume of water, which is then gonna fall from gravity and collide with the rocks and start, creating our water flow, instead of just having one emitter up here and wait for it to flow all the way down there. So we're going to have one single frame emitter and one stream emitter. So we're going to start with an open domain. We're going to have the riverbed as a collider. Control left mouse click. I feel a bit out of it, like not quite used to it and as fast in Realflow as I used to be, but I'm sure we'll pick up speed eventually. So let's make that second collider with a cube and use the 1 key, or maybe I'll start with the 3 key actually. So I'll just make it pretty thin, and move it up to the top, and then we'll move to the 1 key, and I'll just make sure it intersects the pavement stones or whatever they are, and then the 2 key to just make sure it's tall enough. So I guess my idea overall with the scene was going to be some kind of ditch in like a riverbed in the dirt that was kind of like sunken down, and then somebody has kind of made an artificial little brook, babbling brook, with these kind of pavement stones on the sides. And so the idea is that no liquid is going to be on the outside here, and then a bunch of rocks and pebbles inside that's going to create a nice flow over it. And this is really unscripted because I haven't really just made an initial test. I haven't really seen the final result of this. Layout is going to be interesting enough, but we'll just have to see. So let's call this back wall collider connected to the domain. If we take a look at the riverbed isosurface, we'll see that it's probably going to take a while, but the default setting is probably going to be 2 cores. I'm not going to bother too much with setting this to a finer cell size right now, because we're going to have to lower the cell size in the scene overall. So I think we'll wait until we have a satisfactory amount of particles to actually test before we dial down the cell size individually on the Riverbed collider. So we have that collider set up, and both of them are set to solid inside. And I'm going to make another cube. See, I have this habit now from Houdini of control clicking, so gotta get rid of that. But anyway, second cube, which is going to be used for emitter, is just gonna it's gonna intersect with the pavement stones, and it needs to span in length to basically here. We're going to kill all the particles that escape the riverbed, and we're going to leave a little gap there where we're going to have our streaming emitter. But it's not too important. So, tweaking the wrong one. Using the 2 key to go to the front. I'm going to bring it back in again so it's not on the outside of the stones. We're going to have maybe have it a little higher, because we know everything inside of the collider is going to get killed off anyway. And what I did with this one is I merged all the pebbles and stones, and yeah, wasn't a good idea to look through that viewport, was it? But I did combine all the pebbles and stones. I'm going to rotate it, so should have realized that. And then I used like a volume remesh workflow, so that anything that's intersecting, it's all going to be kind of combined into a watertight mesh. I mean, Realflow does a volume conversion when it creates the collider on the first frame anyway, but it was a lot of objects, and I really didn't want to wait around for Realflow to be doing that. Felt better to kind of bake it out in Houdini. Yeah, so I don't really know how much we need. Let's maybe start like this. And this is going to be our Riverbed emission. And I think I'll copy the back wall collider rather than the riverbed, because the riverbed is rotated. And stream emission. And we're just going to take that one. Go here. Maybe I'll bring it in a little bit. We'll see what happens if it kind of splashes out or not. I don't think it needs to intersect as much. Maybe it can be a bit higher up actually. We'll just see how it goes. I think I want the back wall higher up. And then let's also make this one a little grayer, and the emission geos are not going to be seen. We're going to start by selecting the stream emitter, which I duplicated as a collider, but it does not need to be connected to the domain. I'm going to start with the stream emitter, select it, and press emitter. And then make sure stream is selected and connect it to the domain. Then we're going to select the Riverbed, click emitter, make sure stream is not checked, and we're going to connect it to the domain again. So we're at least going to hide the emission geo. Let's keep the emitters for now. I don't think I need to see the Riverbed emitter at all. Maybe the stream emitter will need to give it some velocity, but let's see. Let's add some gravity by pressing tab and search for grav and hit enter and connect that. Don't need to see it. I'm gonna add a drag force. And we're also going to add a K-volume. K-volume is going to be fitted to the collider, the Riverbed collider. And eventually we might want it to delete particles outside of the actual stone walls, but let's see first what happens if anything actually escape. And in length we can definitely trim it down a bit. The whole idea with this project, I mean, I made it about 1.5 meters or 1.6 or 7 meters wide, I can't exactly recall, and about 3 meters in length, so that we would be able to take an isolated part of something like a riverbed or a brook and just max the the detail. So my idea is we're gonna render something like an area like this maybe. We can try to get some nice water shading and lighting, some procedural stone materials and things of that nature, and maybe some grass on the edge or something. We'll see. So we have the initial everything set up. I'm going to press G to hide the grid and save. And let's see, I'm not going to do command line just yet. Let's go to the options for Diverso and just see, sorry, Hybrido. I'm gonna see if the OpenCL GPU helps at all. Otherwise, I'm gonna leave this to default, I think. And yeah, do we really want 30 FPS? Let's do 24. Yeah. I'm just gonna hit the A key on the first frame and see what happens. We do have particles being emitted, but there's not a lot of them. There's in fact 37. So if we look at the voxel size by checking the outer edges of the domain or the plane that visualizes the domain, we can definitely tell we need to lower the scene cell size scale. So let's actually just slice it by a factor of 10 and hit Control A to reset and space to confirm and A again to sim again. So now we have about 50,000-60,000 particles. It's simulating really fast. We're going to need a lot more detail than this. But this allows us to see if we need to make any adjustments early on. I'm not particularly a fan of the box around the domain, so I'm going to go to the display and hide that. Yeah, this might be interesting actually. So let's just continue. I'm going to first of all check what the riverbed collision is looking like now that we lowered the resolution. So it's looking a lot better, and with this I'm feeling kind of secure for now that I can wait a while before dialing in the Riverbed collider at all, because this is already a lot more representative, and I know I'm going to be lowering the cell size more. So we'll see once we're actually happy with the cell size and then start cranking up the sampling settings to add more particles. If the representation of the geo is not detailed enough by then we'll go in and start lowering the cell size here rather than on the scene level. What did I just do? I turned off the visibility. I want to turn off the isosurface. Actually, I also want to turn off by right-clicking and going to show selection highlighting, so I can have something selected without showing the highlighted wireframe, because that's just annoying. Let's lower this again to 0.05. So cutting the resolution in half is going to give us a lot more than twice as many particles. It's going to give us exponentially more particles. So let's see. First frame or so is usually a bit trickier. So now we went up from, what was it? I've forgotten, but now we have 500,000, so we have a lot more. And we can see there's a bit of splashing going on back there. I don't know if we need to be too concerned about it. It's just the initial emission from the riverbed being affected by gravity and splashing back against there. Or is the first few particles being emitted from the stream that is colliding with gravity. And yeah, let's see how much of an issue it is that they kind of end up outside, because I guess they'll be stuck in between here because there's no way to make it back in. We might need to tweak the K volume, but I also don't want to do that if we have detail further down the stream that is naturally escaping. This is more of like an emission problem, and we can add smaller K volumes eventually to combat that once we start getting to the detail we want. So far so good. Even though there's going to be a lot of natural noise and velocities based on the colliders, I probably want to add some noise. And if you're a regular on the channel, you know that we like to show the field, dial down the magnitude, and this isn't always so easy to make out, but can kind of give you an idea at least of where you're at. So this is the default. I feel like space scale, so we want probably one with larger details with lower time scale, and one with higher frequency with pretty much the default time scale. If we increase this, it's going to get more repetitions. A higher space scale gets more repetitions, and a lower space scale makes bigger changes. So probably going to have one at 1 and lower the time scale to, I don't know, 0.5. Strength, let's leave it at 1. Large noise and small noise. So let's put that one to 4 maybe and set it back. I think I'll leave both of them to 0.5. Just a way to get some more interesting detail. And hook them up. And I can just hide them. I don't need to be too concerned about turning off the velocity field representation. Let's see if we need to add any initial velocity to the stream. I don't really think so. Sorry. I should be, of course, resetting and simulating again. So we have 500,000 particles. We need more. We need definitely more, and I still think even if, you know, it looks pretty dense, there's going to take a lot of particles to get satisfying detail around the rocks. So we're going to definitely be putting Realflow through the ropes in this one. So let's lower the cell size scale by half again and see where we end up with that. So every time I'm changing something, I just have, like in my spine muscle memory, I have Control S and then Control A and then space to confirm resetting the timeline, and then A again. So every time I'm changing something and you see the timeline being emptied, I'm doing that. And you may recall, if you wrote frames to disk previously, they're still on disk. It's just that they're not loaded. So we have 3 million particles now. And I think just looking at the spacing between the particles, you can start to think about what kind of detail you have voxel-wise, and probably that's going to be good. But we're definitely going to have to start attacking the sampling settings so we get more particles, because we're going to need more particles to get a detailed mesh, especially in the detailed areas. But now that the frame time is starting to be a little higher, it can be a bit less responsive inside of the GUI. So it's probably time to start iterating this on the command line. You see there, just stopping the sim kind of makes the software unresponsive until it completes the previous step. And you're doing a lot of tweaking and a lot of inputs that can cause a crash. So yeah, so resetting again, and then bringing up checking the command line, and then bringing up the command line options. It's set the same as scene, and then for both range threads and no arguments. As far as threads goes, my CPU is a 2 years old Ryzen 5950X. It has 16 cores to 32 threads. When it comes to Realflow, Hybrido, and hyperthreading, my experience is you don't really get more performance when adding more threads, at least not above, like, depending on your scene, a number of like 4 or 8 threads or something like that. Then it starts to actually take longer instead. I don't know if it's just poorly parallelized or if it's the fact that maybe it needs to do some calculations for each thread regardless. But I'm actually just gonna, we can actually try this eventually, but I'm gonna start. Okay, so let's just try it. I'm gonna start with thread count of 1. So we're gonna do a single core on the command line, and it's gonna hit the A key, and it's gonna bring up the command line for me. So it has completed frame 0, and we saw that frame 0 took 46 seconds, and now it started frame 1. And frame 1, let's see how long it takes. Frame 1 took about as long. We're at a total of 123 1 minute 23 seconds. So I'm probably just gonna let it run like 4 frames or something, and then we're gonna try it again. So 4 frames took 346, and it's now started frame 5, and I'm gonna cancel it. 346 on a single thread, and then let's go to 2 threads and go again. Alright, so 4 frames finished. It's a 406. So we're already losing 20 seconds. Let's see if we get any difference with 4. And like I said, this can be different from scene to scene, but it can be worthwhile to try to find the sweet spot before you start iterating, because you might save a lot of time over, you know, all the resims and tweaks that you do. And then at least, you know, at least now we know for the state that the scene is in now, then when we start getting higher particle counts, maybe we should try it again. I don't know. But like I said, I've had cases where it's faster on 2 and 4 threads than on 1, and then once I start going into 6 or 8, then it starts to go down. So it's going to be interesting to see if this is the case. I think this is going to be like a high particle count sim. It's going to have a lot of just a high impact on the RAM, I think, like because the collider is pretty dense, like a volume thing, and then there's a lot of voxels, there's a lot of particles. So I wonder if it is like the memory management between multiple threads in Realflow that is the kind of like weak spot. Because I know, especially when you do Diverso, for example, it seems to be, you know, faster the more threads you add to it, but Hybrido does not seem as you know, optimized for multi-threading. So 4 frames at 4 threads was 3 minutes 02. So now we're starting to get somewhere. Let's see what we get from 6. Wrong settings dialog. I'm going to change it only for the command line, not for the scene. 6 threads. So we're down to 222. Let's see if it keeps dropping when we add more threads. Oops. Wish I had that many threads. Let's not forget to close to previous sim. So 213. Let's maybe do 10 threads rather than 12. And now we have 214 on 10 threads. So maybe, you know, obviously there's a lot of factors that play in here, but maybe we're kind of on the sweet spot with 8 threads, you know, for this scenario. And of course it might depend how much RAM you have, how fast your RAM is. There's also like storage speeds. I'm currently writing to a SATA drive, which is the only one I have space on, but I think for this scenario, for this instance, we should be on 8 threads. And so what do we need to do now? Let's look at the first few frames, or yeah, we probably need 10-20 frames to see what the details are starting to look like when this big bunch of particles has fallen down and started flowing down. So we're going to let our 8 threads, chew through maybe 10-20 frames of this sim or more. I'll take a little break and be back once we have something to look at. So while I'm waiting for that, maybe just have a quick look and talk about where the idea came from. With so this lesson is loosely based on this one, where we not so much did the open domain workflow where we kill the particles to get out of screen. I just wanted to try to have some kind of like a flowing sim, like a river sim, and get nice details in both the mesh and the foam. And why I set it up this way, and this one, like I said, is just to be able to focus on one area and then max out the details. So I hope we're going to be able to bring the particle count as high as possible to get a really nice mesh, and then get a decent foam secondary emission as well, maybe bubbles and splash too. So it's more or less just a rinse and repeat of everything we've been doing on the channel. Maybe this time around we'll change some things up as far as how to render it. I don't have a Maya license anymore, which would have been my go-to if we're not using Houdini. So I'm thinking, once we have something we want to see, maybe we'll just have a try at importing it into Blender. Actually, I'm trying to, I don't know how that's going to work, like with alembic cache sequences rather than one file, and alembic point caches. We just have to experiment a bit. I think sometimes great things can come from just jumping in the deep end and try to figure something out. So I think I'll wait a few more minutes before we take a look at this. So I now have 34 frames. It's probably going to take a lot longer for everything to resolve into a natural stream or whatever, and get rid of the fact that it feels like we kind of dumped a truckload of water, which we essentially have. But let's just load up the frames in the cache and just try to assess if we think, like I said, I know we definitely want more particles, but does the voxel resolution seem to be detailed enough? And I kind of, it might be a gamble, we might need to change it further down the line, but I think for now, because I see water is making its way between the stone wall and the rock, and that tells me that, the voxel size isn't clunky enough that it blocks off this area. I see liquid running down some of the details of the rock. I can't really make out yet if it is too coarse, like if there's gonna be a bit of a gap, but I see like liquid coming in between these two stones. It looks pretty detailed. So I'm going to say that I'm settled for now with voxels, which means I'm not going to be changing the cell size. I'm going to be changing the sampling settings to get more particles. And so you can do that a number of ways. The first step I like to take is go to the emitter and just cranking up the particle surface sampling and the core particles sampling. So it's going to be a voxel is 3-dimensional, so this number to the power of 3, 2 particles in the x-axis, 2 particles in the y-axis, and 2 particles in the z-axis means 8. So if you do 3, you'll essentially have 27 per core particle, and 4 is going to be 64 or whatever. Yeah, I just got a little unsure. I had to actually bring up the calculator and check. That means 64 particles per voxel, and that's only on the surface. And the riverbed emission, maybe we don't need that there, because they're eventually going to go, like by the time we actually get something we want to render. maybe these particles. Let's just set it to 3 on the surface and leave it at that. But we're probably, since we're allowing to sample up to 64 particles per voxel, we should also be visiting the sampling settings on the domain itself, because there's a setting there called min and max sampling control. And I don't want it to be limiting it back down to 16 per voxel. So I'm going to turn off the max sampling control. Min sampling of 8. It's going to supersede 8 easily anyway, like all the core is going to be 8. If you have a particle sampling setting of 2. So with those settings, let's see if we get way too many particles and how long each frame is going to take. So now we're about 20 frames into the sim again, and we see that we're about 22 million particles. So then we can start, even though, like I said, it's not going to have fully resolved, we can start trying to figure out if this is the kind of detail we want. And I actually think it's on a good enough place where we will try the whole workflow and seeing it rendered before actually trying to squeeze any more detail out of the sim. So I'm probably going to let this I'm probably going to let this carry on. But in the meantime, we can mesh a few frames and see how it works to bring them into Blender. So we're going to go to the Mesh tab and create a Hybrido VDB-mesh. And I had already selected the domain, and we're going to change the default color because I hate it. More bluish is what I like, maybe a bit darker actually. And so it's going to get auto polygon size, auto particle radius. These usually don't look so good, but let's just first of all press F12, checks the export central, and verify it's indeed writing out mesh cache ABC, which I think is what we want. And then I also want to make sure one other thing. I don't know how it's going to work in Blender, but if it's up to me, I at least want, you know, the velocity information encoded on the mesh. It's enabled. So what we can do then is build this frame. So we're going to have to smooth shaded. I mean, I think this is interesting. It's just quite blobby. Let's try to see the domain at the same time. Let's see if we can see an area. We can compare them. So we see that the mesh is a bit blobby. I think we need to lower the triangle size. We also need to lower the particle radius without getting to a state where we start to make out lumps of individual particles. We could also tackle the fact that it's too big. Instead of lowering the radius, we can introduce filtering. So let's see which one works best. I think, as usual, it's a good idea to set this to bounded and tweak the size. Let's go down to the last fourth of this and enable Mesh Interactive. When you do that, it's always going to build, and when you change something, it instantly updates. So we've already disabled auto polygon size. Some people say, or I think even the manuals say, that should be half of the cell size, which is what we got here. But typically you need to lower it even more. So I'm going to knock it down a bit. And then we can start thinking about whether or not we want to reduce the particle size or use filtering. I already see that there's a bit of tendency for lumps here. Let's maybe check an area a little further up. Yeah. We need to dilate, and I should have remembered that the default settings for the dilate is way too high, so sometimes it creates such a big volume that it eats up all the RAM and crashes, so we're gonna have to wait a bit. So it crashed and I'm loading it back up, but you know, I save often and we have the command line running in the background, so it's not too much of an issue. We'll just have to recreate the mesh. And do all the steps we did with that, and enable the bounded. And so before I press Mesh Interactive, I'm going to add volume filter, dilate, smooth, and erode. And I'm just going to take this one down a lot. And then smooth 2 or 3 times in the same value. Now we can say Mesh Interactive. Okay, let's disable all the filters and see why it's not. Something's up. Oh, we're at frame 0. Should probably be on the latest finished frame, which is frame 30. So let's do 28 or 29. It's gonna re-enable all my filters and try to build. Okay, so we're back. I think it's looking promising. Apparently I angered Realflow gods. Let's maybe stay clear of the interactive meshing for now. We still have it set to bounded. I think we have a color I can live with. We turn off the polygon size. Let's just save again and build mesh. On frame 32 or 31, typo, but I can live with that. Something we're doing is taking a bit too long. I feel like it's almost taking 2 minutes to mesh this little portion of it, so I'll probably revert to auto polygon size and can't for the love of God figure out why it's so extremely heavy. Or turn off bounded, just build one frame. So after a few crashes and trial and error, I think I narrowed it down to the dilate filter, and or I was still creating it too big of a volume. Now it meshed pretty quick with the whole thing, even on frame 30 where I'm at now. So I'm going to continue and do splash thinning filter. And I immediately felt like the splash thinning filter added way too much, at like 2 or 3 minutes. So I'm going to get rid of it again. And instead, see what we can do about I'm just continuing to gradually knock down this number and continuing to build. Last build, I definitely see some new details pop up here, so I think we need more resolution for sure. And you can also tell by just looking at the wireframe. I feel like you can see that that's not going to be enough, but alright, so I think I dialed in a few settings where I started to see a little more detail. A little bit bumpy, but I'm gonna leave it like that because I think we kind of have nice detail. So I think right now is a good point in time for me to have this run overnight. So in order to have the sim, it's a quarter into it. It's probably gonna take another couple of hours. So I'm gonna set the domain to cache and set this command line options to mesh and let that run. I'm probably going to do the same for a first secondaries pass. So let's create a splash, connect it, and we're going to connect all of the daemons. Going to collect the colliders. Then I'm going to do liquid Hybrido particles. Cell size should probably be similar to what we have. Let's do twice as much. Let's just see what we get. I'm gonna leave all these to default for now. And I'm also gonna set up a foam. And while we're at it, let's do bubbles too. Okay. Well, as for all of these secondaries, actually enable limbic. Just in case we want to utilize that to import them for render. I don't really know what's going to work out, but it feels like limbic is the most common denominator. So we'll just have to find out if that's something that's going to work for us. This time around, I don't want to build the mesh. I'm going to disable it on the command line as well. And then start that too. So now we have 3 processes with 8 threads each. I guess this could be interesting to see if they can manage with the memory I have. But it looks like the main sim is taking like 1/3 of the memory, so maybe it'll be alright. Maybe it'll crash and I'll have to do the secondaries later, or maybe one at a time. But I'm just gonna try to let this run for now. So that's the main sim, this is the mesh, and these are the secondaries. So I'll be back when this is done. Well, it seems like I made a bit of a rookie mistake in not having enough disk space or setting an overflow drive. I honestly don't have too much disk space currently at all in my system, but the project has already taken up 300 gigs. I think the particle caches for the domain itself is around 2.3 gigs per frame. So yeah, we can at least see that the main sim itself, at the time it stopped, so it's got until frame 159, and then it was around 50 million particles, which should give us pretty decent detail. And it's still, you know, feels like a lot, like it's definitely not interactive, but you do need to get up to these particle counts when you want to have enough detail in a sim like this. So sometimes maybe you need even more. So I'd say like 2 or 3 minutes per frame is not too bad. So that's the cache itself for the particles, which I'm previewing right now, which is going to take a while, just for the sake of loading them in the OpenGL viewport. The mesh seems to take around 3 minutes 20 per frame, as far as it got at least. It would probably have been taking longer in the end, because it got to frame 124, and then the particle count was about 10 million lower than the last frames that finished. But we'll have a look at the mesh as well in a bit. The mesh, so I kind of overlooked something. I'm previewing, and that means it's writing files to disk, so it's probably going to be a bit sluggish. The mesh seems to be clocking in around 300 megs per frame towards the end, or as far as it got at least, which is not too bad. And then we have the secondaries, the splash. Usually the default settings is not detailed enough. It's only on frame, okay, so it only got to frame 11 before it crashed. Yeah, 500,000 foam particles, 44,000 bubble particles. We'll have a look at these eventually as well, and then I'll just have to have a think and pause and free up some more disk space so we can finish the project. So I'll be back when this is previewed. So here we have the frames that finished before I ran out of disk space. You can see the particle count as we get more details, and thus more voxels that are considered as surface. The particle count increases and approaches 55 million towards the end. So it'll be interesting to see how this looks in the end. I think it's, you know, I think it looks like there's quite some nice details in here. So now I'm going to play blast the mesh. And here is the preview of the mesh. which, all things considered, I think I'm starting to get pretty excited about this because there's some pretty nice detail. There are things that could be better, but maybe, you know, with motion blur and with secondaries, I think this is going to come out pretty alright. I mean, I like the fact that there's so much detail around the rocks. You see the liquid kind of wrapping to it, and even though it kind of looks blobby sometime when there's like a sheet passing by, it kind of gets in between the stones. There's a lot of little eddies and details that I think are going to come out pretty well. So I'm excited to try to take this into render and then figure out disk space and then secondaries. So yeah, maybe we'll just wrap this up for now as a part 1 and take it from there in the next chapter. Stay tuned. I put a lot of time and effort into creating these videos every month for Realflow, Houdini, and other apps in the 3D content creation realm, and I want to keep them available for free. Some people have even said some of my tutorials are the best videos available for learning Realflow. If you're a fan of the channel and want to help support me in making more videos happen, the best way is if you'd consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. Aside from a few perks like early access to upcoming videos and more, you send a clear signal that you appreciate my work and you want the channel to stick around. There's a link in the video description, and I thank you in advance for your consideration. See you in the next one.